Have you come to a point in your Christian walk where you feel like you may have been a little bit disappointed and you may feel a little bit lost, and someone encourages you to keep pursuing, keep following after the faith, and that kind of pushes you to keep going? Well, today we're going to see a little bit of that in the book of Ruth. I'm going to share with you how I verse map and study the most famous speech in Ruth. So we're going to be unpacking two short verses. It's Ruth 1:16 and 17. So when I verse map something, it's just good to have, a translation that you can read and understand first in English before kind of diving into the original languages. Verse mapping is just a way for you to understand and dissect what the Bible is talking about. So when you study the Bible, there are many kind of general methods to the study, and verse map is just one of the tools. So instead of reading an entire passage and figuring out what it's saying and what it's telling you, you kind of narrow it down to a smaller focus. So for me, I just have a couple of verses here. We're going to dive into it, review the words that are in it, and kind of understand its meaning in that sense. So we're still keeping in line with basic inductive Bible study principles. So we're going to observe the text, we're going to interpret and apply it, and kind of suss out the meaning from there. This on this current page may look like a lot, but this is just two verses. The top is the English translation ESV, and below it is the Hebrew, and those are for the two verses that we're going to be studying today. So one of the first things I do is read it through and pick out some kind of key words that not only stick out, but if I compare different translations, these are kind of the words that shift and change throughout the verses. I've kind of color coded this so you can see at the top in red it says do not urge, and then that is related to this Hebrew term right here, which is al pagah, and I've kind of like listed the definition of that word, the Hebrew word, below. So that kind of gives me kind of an expanded context and meaning for the words that we're going to be studying in this passage. As you can tell, each color-coded word, and I put kind of the transliteration from Hebrew right next to it, and then its kind of definitions next to it. And for this last statement in Ruth 1:17, I've used this pink color to just kind of notate what is the difference, what is it really trying to say. So instead of breaking down each word, this entire verse is kind of considered like an oath. So I've included kind of the cross references that kind of reinforce or kind of showcase how this statement is used throughout the Bible. So that's where all the other cross references that are listed show where else does this oath-taking language take place. So this page is a list of kind of the top main translations that I like to work off of, and this is a little bit overkill, honestly, but I have color-coded it according to the words that I used in the previous page, and I just wanted to be able to see the different ways translators have used different words to mean the same thing, to kind of get the same point across. And so that's where it's color-coded, and then this numbering system is correlated with the number of variations of words that are used for a particular word. So different translations of the Bible have translated this word leave into three different words. It can be leave, it can be abandon, or it can be forsake. So just knowing that that particular word has been translated into different ways kind of allows you to expand your understanding of what the word is trying to say. So that's just the way how I like to organize my thoughts and how to perceive things and map things out. And you don't have to use all these translations, but I just find it valuable because a lot of times some of these translations are very similar, and it's kind of hard to tell which ones say different words if you're only reading three translations. Sometimes they're all going to say the exact same thing. And so I have kind of organized all the different variations of the translations and the words that they use for that specific Hebrew word in the color that I have in the previous pages. So I think it's kind of interesting how different Bible translations will choose a word, and it goes alongside kind of their thinking, their policy for translating the Bible. The difference between leave, abandon, and forsake, the actual terms are not too different. They're fairly interchangeable, and they kind of have a different connotation, and they kind of are more relevant for some people than others. That's kind of why they choose it. Some people really like the word forsake. Studying different translations is interesting, and studying the different words that they use is interesting because it kind of showcases the thought process of the translators. And it's not to say that, one word is better than the other, but that it's helpful for people to understand. And it goes along with the meaning and the interpretation of what they think the passage is kind of saying. Overall, this specific word doesn't really have a huge difference. Like, doesn't make a difference to the text if you use leave versus abandon or forsake. Like, you kind of still get the gist of it. For me, the most interesting part that kind of makes me dive into this study more is the word lodge or lun in Hebrew. So there's 4 variations of the word lodge, or the way they translate the word lodge in the different Bibles. This is the point where word for word or thought for thought translation kind of matters. And this is where you can kind of see this in play. So the word is lun, and the traditional meaning is lodge. So if I go back to kind of the translation I have written here, to lodge, lun, it means stop over or pass the night. That's kind of like your gloss, your simple translation. Lodge is used in many translations, and that's perfectly okay. And it's interesting that the NASB translates it to sleep. So lodge, stop over, pass the night. It implies sleep. So I can see how that is a more literal translation. And then live and stay. So live in the CSB, NET, and NLT translation is kind of interpretation of lodge. So what does it mean to lodge? Does it mean to live, or does it mean to stay? So I found it interesting how the CSB, the NET, NLT, even NIV use the word live and stay. And lodge can have more than one meaning in general. Lodge kind of has multiple meanings, and you can dive into what lodge means. It can mean staying in one place for the night in a temporary fashion, but lodge can also mean stay and settle. So it has a living aspect. And this kind of shows how different translations can interpret a word, and it gives an interpretation to what the verse is trying to say. In this case, NASB is trying to be literal and says, where you sleep, I sleep, right? Like, where you stay, I stay. It's kind of a literal word for word translation in a sense. And the word lodge also has that kind of sense of like, you stay the night. So they both kind of keep well into that kind of aspect of temporary lodgings, I guess, temporary stays, sleeping, that sort of thing. But the CSB, NET, and NLT, even NIV, it gives a little bit more depth. So it could be where I live, you live. Where you stay, I stay. And it gives increased sense and importance of what Ruth is saying. Moving on to this second verse, verse 17, I've only highlighted the second half of this verse. And that's primarily because the very first half of the verse, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried, is pretty much the same throughout all translations. So that is something that, you don't have to really dig into, because it basically says what it says. Versus, if you go to the second half of this verse, it's translated in many different variations. So as you can see, I have kind of my 10 translations here, and out of the 10 translations, there are basically 8 variations of this line. So I thought that was really interesting, because this really showcases that you can't really have a one-to-one, word-for-word correlation of this particular point of this verse. This part of the verse requires interpretation. It requires more nuance, and that they can interpret it and write it in a different way, in several different ways, but still kind of get the point across. This is Ruth making an oath. Basically, he's just saying, how people say, like, I swear on my life, or I swear on God to do something as a promise. This is kind of the same language that's used. It's this kind of oath making and taking the kind of serious and gravity of the situation and of the speech. I found it interesting how different translations have kind of put these words together, and it still says the same thing, but in different ways. And even if the words are rearranged, or if other words are utilized, it ultimately says the same thing. So you can't necessarily say that one is better than the other, or that they're all wrong, but that they're just all looking at it from different perspectives and trying to interpret it in the best way that you would understand. So in a case like this, where it's like an oath-making pact, I don't think the exact words matter so much as you get the point across of how Ruth is basically saying, you know, I make this promise and I hold God accountable to that promise. Basically, like, I stake my life on this, is kind of the interpretation of this passage. So that was kind of how I go about using different translations and kind of looking at the individual words and figuring out its meaning. So that's kind of the overview of how I do verse mapping. I read these verses and it just has echoes of other things that I've heard of before in the Bible, but I can't quite place them. And so this is why I'm studying it, is because I hear these words and I feel like I've heard these before. I just don't know where, and I was kind of searching for them, because if you look at the cross references for this verse, there really isn't any, and it doesn't really showcase like where there are connections to what Ruth is saying here. And so this next section is kind of a little bit different than a traditional verse mapping or word study on a verse. So I mentioned that, you know, I can't really figure out where I've heard these words before in Ruth. And I didn't figure this out by myself. I had to do a little digging, check some commentaries, listen to some sermons, listen to what other people have to say. And there was this tiny little passage where it mentioned about how, you know, this passage references a lot of God's promises, God's covenant making language. And I kind of dug into that. And the strongest sense that I have is in Genesis 28. I kind of tried to color code once again in different colors, because I was doing this at a different time, of where I've heard these words spoken before. And so there are kind of the echoes here. So, you know, whither thou goest, thy God, my God, the Lord shall be my God. And so that kind of led me to see parallels between Genesis 28 and Ruth 1:16 to 17. So going down this rabbit trail, it kind of led me to the story of Jacob. Now, this particular chapter is talking about Jacob's dream and Jacob's ladder, where he sees this stairway to heaven and the angels are going up and down it, and God speaks to him in the dream and gives him this amazing promise. And the language there actually really echoes what is said in Ruth, and I thought that was really fascinating. So I would encourage you to kind of look and see that for yourself, not only in Genesis 28, also in Genesis 35, I believe. Jacob returns back to this exact place and God reiterates his promise again. And you can just see how that language once again is repeated. Kind of got my head spinning, and I can see that connection between Jacob and Ruth. But not only that, if you just look into the story of Ruth, there are still echoes and references back to Jacob, in the Jacob story overall. And that has been really interesting, and it kind of got me thinking, like, why does it matter? What is the significance of this? That kind of led me to an interesting place, looking and digging into Ruth's speech. In the end of Ruth 4:11, the elders and all the people are talking about and make mention to Rachel, Leah, and Israel, also known as Jacob. And it also locates the place Bethlehem and Ephrath. What's interesting to me is that the whole story of Ruth, while it's this great love story and it talks about, you know, the kinsman redeemer and how it points to Christ, I think we only look at the surface, that we kind of ignore how it's connected to the rest of the Bible. And one of the things I discovered, and this is really nerdy, just diving into genealogies and stuff, but once you dive into the genealogy, you see through Ruth's marriage to Boaz, she unites the family of Jacob. She unites Leah's family with Rachel's family, because Boaz is of the line of Judah, and Ruth is the widow of Mahlon, and Mahlon is of the line of Benjamin, which is Rachel's son. The story of Jacob, with all its deception and pain and separation and breaking apart of family, Ruth is kind of the opposite, the coming together of family, the reuniting of family, and also the promise of kingship, that the bloodline is a united bloodline of kingship in David, and that you can see that God promises in Genesis 35 that kings will come from Jacob. That part of the promise doesn't come into fruition until we get to Ruth. Ruth is kind of the one who brings those families together and kind of helps to fulfill that promise where kings can be from this line. Not only that, but there's also another reference to some other characters that were mentioned in Genesis, and that is Judah and Tamar. And then the story of Judah and Tamar is very similar to the story of Ruth and Boaz in some respects. The story of Ruth and Boaz fixes the mistakes made in Tamar and Judah's story. And not only that, if you go back a little bit further, Ruth is a Moabite, and that's important and significant because the Moabites come from Moab, and that was the son of Lot and his daughters, which is also another similar story to what happened to Judah and Tamar. So these deception stories are redeemed in Ruth and Boaz. It's almost like Ruth and Boaz do the right thing that was wrong or that was mistaken in the Lot and his daughter story that founded the Moabites, and also in the Judah and Tamar story that the son was Perez, which is Boaz's ancestor. So I just thought it was interesting how that kind of unites the family in that sense. But not only that, it unites Judah into this timeline or into this family line as well. Jacob names Judah as the progenitor of kings. He is blessed to say, kingship should come from his descendants. So while the story of Ruth showcases this individual couple, the significance of it in a grander scale isn't shown until you kind of backtrack and see how that plays out in past genealogies, and so that it create this future genealogy of David. It pushes forward into Jesus, and you can see this kind of aspect of that Levirate marriage also echoed into the story of Mary and Joseph. Joseph takes in Mary and raises Jesus as his own child, but also knowing that he is continuing on the legacy of the man who's not there, and that is God, right? Like, it has this kind of echo. While Jesus is the Redeemer and our Savior, the Mary and Joseph story echoes that Levirate marriage aspect, that kind of idea of continuing on the family name. Jesus becomes continuing on God's name, and that shows so much depth and richness to all of these stories. All these seemingly unconnected stories are connected together, and it kind of knits together the fabric of the Bible, where the story of Lot, the story of Judah and Tamar, the story of Ruth, and the story of Jesus all kind of coalesce together in this way, and it showcases that kind of redeeming aspect, this reuniting aspect of the Bible and of the people of Israel and how they're able to kind of move forward. It's not until Jesus where you get the fulfillment of that final promise that was given in the covenant, where the nations will bless you and the nations will join you in blessing God. And it is because of Jesus that the rest of the world knows of God and the rest of the world can worship God. And that's kind of where we are in our present day as Christians, is we are kind of the embodiment of that last promise that God made to Abraham in the beginning, to some of the great patriarchs in the Old Testament. It's not on the timeline that we expect. It's not on the timeline that these people in the past have expected. It's on God's timeline, and he will fulfill it how he sees fit. And sometimes we won't be able to see and make all those connections. But when we do, it's mind-blowing. It's crazy to think that God has kept this family together. God has been able to keep these disparate, separate peoples, these broken families and relationships, and put it back together in such a way that it points all the way through to Jesus. Now let's go back to Ruth 1:16. Ruth echoes what God is saying to Jacob. In this sense, she acts like God to Naomi. She is being the protector, the reassurer, the hand that is encouraging Naomi to stick to her faith. This echoed back to Jacob, where he was on the run, he was desperate, he was homeless, he's on his way to Laban because he tricked and got the blessing away from Esau. And God says, you know, you will have this grand future, but immediately for your comfort, know that I will be with you. I will follow you, and I will make sure that I will not leave you until what I say is true has been fulfilled. And Ruth says kind of the same thing to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. I will not leave you until I die, and no one can separate us. That is very strong language. And I find that really comforting, that it's this outsider as this embodiment of the faith that Naomi should have. And I think sometimes that's what we need in our lives. When everything seems hard, when everything just doesn't seem like it's going our way, or it just seems like we're in this season of pain and suffering, and you have someone in your life, a Ruth in your life, who tells you that, you know, I will be with you. I will stay with you until my mission is complete. It's the same as God saying, I will be with you. I will follow you wherever you go. You cannot go somewhere where I will not be. And have that sense of comfort as well. There is that echo, once again, of God saying, I will never leave you or forsake you. And I think that's something that I didn't find in the speech of Ruth initially. But by looking at it, you can see that, because Ruth is the outsider. Ruth is the person kind of least expected to follow God. Naomi is the one that's supposed to be the one to say these things, but it is Ruth, someone that you are least likely to expect to follow God, to say these things to your life, to help you, to be your protector, and in a sense to help bring back redemption, help you repent and come back to God. That is something I didn't see before in the speech. You know, we always talk about, oh, it's Ruth's loyalty to Naomi, and how she's showing how she's so loyal, she will follow Naomi to the ends of the earth, to go wherever she will go, and will refuse to leave her side. And I think that's great. It does show that, and also shows her faith in God, and it just embodies what God is to us, that God will be with us no matter what. And not only that, she is protecting Naomi too. Because as you go back in context, it says that it's in the days of the judges. And you also realize they're trying to make this journey from Moab to Bethlehem. And sometimes we don't necessarily understand that distance and that environment because we are removed from that place. You will realize that they're trying to make a 50-mile journey back to Bethlehem. That's like a 7 to 10 day journey by foot. Not only that, it was during the days of the judges. So basically this is like in the middle of tribal warfare, and they're trying to travel. 2 single women traveling in unknown territory, war-torn territory almost, trying to get back safely. And the thing is that a lot could happen in that time. And it probably took all their money, all their resources to go back. It's not an easy journey. It's not like, oh, I'll just walk you down the block and you'll be home. No, this is a very extended commitment on Ruth's part to do this. And in a sense, it's saying, you know, we both may die together on the way, but I will help you. And God is going to be with us to do that. It does show her commitment. It does show Ruth's loyalty to Naomi, but also it shows a little bit of riskiness. It shows the strength of her character, the strength of who she is, because she is willing to leave behind everything she knows, to go to a place she has no idea or concept of, maybe just what she's heard from them, and go to a place where she is not accepted. She is the outsider, and she's willing to do that. I think we would be really hard-pressed to find someone like that today. Ruth is mentioned in the Bible. It's almost like saying, like, my greatest enemy is also the biggest embodiment of the greatest follower. It's like the least likely person to follow after God is the one who follows God in the best way possible. And taking that to our modern day life and to kind of an application, how can we see that? How can we embody that? And in some ways we can't. Like, in some ways we could never be like Ruth, or we may not be outsiders, but we are. As Christians, we are grafted onto the family of God. We are adopted peoples. And sometimes we forget that because we just think like, we're Christians, we're all Christians. There's this mentality almost that kind of erases that understanding that, we are like Ruth. We are the outsiders who have come into the fold. And sometimes it's those outsiders, those people outside, those non-Christians who can speak to us in ways that convict us deeper than we can do for them. And I just found it really fascinating. And I can just dive in deeper and keep on studying and keep on making these connections. I'm going to stop it there. Just these 2 little verses has so much depth and richness that it's just mind-boggling. It just shows how much is in the Bible. It shows how much God is working in these very few words and showcases how much there is to study. So thank you for coming with me on this journey to study a little bit in the book of Ruth. I'll see you in the next episode. Bye.